Alright everybody, this is Video Game Growing Pains, and we are back to talk about Final Fantasy X's sequel. I'm going to say this up front, there will be a few minor spoilers to the end of 10 because it is a sequel. First off, you ought to know the name of the sequel, Final Fantasy X 2. Why Square Enix? Why would you do that? Before we get into it, this game needs a little bit of introduction. It was meant to be a stark contrast and very different from Final Fantasy X. Nobuo Uematsu did not return for music work, though a lot of his original tracks came back, and the advertising focused very heavily on the three female leads. Yuna and Riku from Final Fantasy X returned, along with a new character named Pain. The game focused very heavily on their, for lack of a better word, dressing up. And the viral media was all about showing off these three hot women in different scantily clad outfits. Knowing this, you might think the game is a terrible cash-in. You would probably think so even more if you'd seen the pop song commercials, because they were full of badly translated Japanese pop. That being said, the game is really good. I was embarrassed to go out and buy it, but playing it, I realize it's actually a really solid title. So, let's talk a little bit about Final Fantasy X. Getting story out of the way here. Right after Final Fantasy X, Titus dies. Sort of. It's a little confusing. Yuna, having basically brought peace to the entire world, gives up her summoner's garb and decides to become a sphere hunter. Spheres are, well, they're sort of like magical artifacts from Spira. Not really covered on very much in the original game, but more in 10 too. She hopes to find a way to bring Titus back. She's helped with her friend Riku, who is both kind of a relative to her and a friend of Titus, and a new lady, Pain, who we don't learn a lot about right away. The story right off the bat feels very unusual because it opens with a Japanese pop song translated into English. We see a lot of scantily clad, semi-underage, midriff, breast, cleavage, ass, what have you. It feels very strange getting into the game. There's one other thing you also ought to know. This game's tone is much different from Final Fantasy X. Whereas 10 had a very somewhat somber tone to it quite often, Titus reflecting on his story, Yuna very mature and determined to give her life to save the world. This tone is all about the jokes and the laughing. There's plenty of very bad jokes in the script. There's plenty of weird moments. The girls even have a bloody hot spring moment. They go to a hot spring and bathe together while the player watches. Story is not the strongest aspect here. To get it out of the way, we have three factions hunting for the spheres. The new priesthood, the Albed, and a group of Neo-Crusaders who are basically trying to bring order and security to the world. Alongside them are a group of inept Team Rocket-esque villains called LeBlanc and Crew, and all of them sort of clash as Yuna tries to get her hands on the spheres to try and revive Titus. It all comes to a head when they learn of an ancient superweapon that was in construction in the past, and how the ghost of, well, someone who was in love with her in her past life, yeah, it's confusing, is coming back, possessing people, and trying to take over the weapon. And so she has to destroy the weapon, purify the ghost, and still hopefully find a way to save Titus. The script is awful. I'm going to say that right freaking now. There are so many terrible moments in it where you're just like, oh, did they really do that? Yuna goes undercover and gives massages to the scantily clad female villain LeBlanc in a similarly unusual harem-esque outfit that covers her face. One of the big plans for stopping the villain is love. They have the characters hiding out in mascot suits. The script is stupid. That being said, if you're not going to take it too seriously, it's actually kind of enjoyable in its idiocy. The story does have some very dark moments. Learning about Pain's past is very, very dark. Seeing some of the things happening with the ghost and the characters, very dark. But the story is meant to be quite lighthearted, and I can understand why they did this. They wanted a very different kind of Final Fantasy, and it was understandable. Final Fantasy X-2 was, I believe, the first direct sequel we ever got, so they wanted to shake things up. Basically, their idea was, this game is going to make us money regardless of what we do. Fuck it. Let's have fun. Let's do what we want to do with this game. And they did. And to be honest, gameplay-wise, it actually turned out pretty good. Musically, the game is a bit hit or miss, okay? We have some really powerful vocal songs. 1,000 Words comes to mind. But we also have some very unusual pop songs, like Real Emotion. The script and the music teeters between pop idol, which is kind of what Yuna has become, and the somber, brilliant, brooding, but often lighthearted orchestral themes of Nobuo Uematsu. Sadly, no heavy metal. The music is weird. If you let it, it will grow on you, but it takes time. Oh, God, does it. Graphically, the game is almost exactly the same as Final Fantasy X. There are some interesting changes to the aesthetics, such as the characters' clothing, and all three characters do, to their credit, have unique outfits based on each of the classes that the game gives them. We'll talk about that in a minute. But aesthetically, the world is the same. You know the world. The characters dress the same. It's very much, what you've come to expect from Final Fantasy X. Gameplay-wise, the game is actually quite compelling. Like I said, there's a big knee-jerk reaction to the scantily clad clothes, and I am right there with you. But if you can get past that, the game uses what's called garment grids and dress spheres to basically make a job class system. I wish they just called it a job class system. Garment grid and dress sphere is stupid. However, it's actually a nice evolution of what we've seen from Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy Tactics and the other Final Fantasies. You see, you get a lot of very unique jobs, some that we've seen before, like Dark Knight or Alchemist, some new ones like Gunner or Mascot or Berserkers, and some specialized to the characters, which are basically the replacement for summons, which we don't have anymore. All of them are very interesting aesthetically, and they have very special skills. However, you can switch jobs on the fly in the middle of battle, giving you an incredible amount of variety with what you can do. You can't switch unlimited. The garment grid allows you to junction basically a certain number of dress spheres into slots, so you can choose from usually between 3 to 7 at most jobs that you can switch between. There's a lot of restrictions on it, but it gives you an incredible amount of combo variety. One of the favorites of players, for example, was to equip an item which deals max damage if you're at low health, turn into a Dark Knight, bring your health down to 0, well, not 0, 1, and then start going as a gunner and blowing the crap out of things. There was a supremely large amount of variety here. And I have to say, gameplay-wise, it was quite fun. It was your standard turn-based battle system, but the jobs made it more interesting. We don't see any new enemies, except for the bosses, but it's okay. It works for it. The game's job system is easily the best part of it, and I have to admit, despite the weird aesthetic with how the women are dressed, I love it. It's incredibly fun to play. Now, that being said, the game is ironically even more replayable than Final Fantasy X. The game has a percentage tracker which keeps a track of how much of the game you've completed, and your endings get longer depending on how much you do. There's an incredible amount of variety and secret areas you can visit. You can learn about Pain's past, you can visit several deep, dark, scary secret dungeons, you can purify summoned beasts, you can do so much. You can... Blitzball is no longer a thing, but there's plenty of other mini-games to go to, and the world is open to you pretty much right from the start. Now, admittedly, there's a lot of weirdness in the game. The unusual incestuous-esque relationship between Yuna and her sort of cousin. It doesn't lead to anything, and it's not offensive, but it's just... what? There is a lot of weirdness in the game. If you're willing to put that aside and you can look past the seemingly sexist, seemingly girly, I am not even sure what they were aiming for with the marketing aesthetic, then the game is actually a lot of fun to play. And while it's not as good as Final Fantasy X, it's definitely fun. It's definitely a worthwhile experience. And honestly, this, in my opinion, is what we could have had. Now, I said in the last video that what I would have liked is for us to flip back and forth, having games some like Final Fantasy X, some like Final Fantasy 9, 8, 7, 6, those. Final Fantasy X-2 could have been one of the 10 light games, taking ideas from previous Final Fantasies and evolving them, trying to change for new things, having a more upbeat tone, having pop music instead of uematsu. What worked could be kept, what didn't couldn't be. It could have been the experimental series of the two. That being said, it's still a fun game, even though the changes after this, I would say, are pretty detrimental to the series. In some aspects, not all of them. So, Final Fantasy X-2. I give it a recommend. It's not a bad game. Even Noah Antweiler, the Spoony one, was very conciliatory towards it. While he still was ripping it to shreds over the cutscenes and the script and the acting, which, it was better than 10, but not good. The game itself is still quite solid. Now we move on to something a little bit different. Next time, we're talking about Final Fantasy's biggest change ever, and the one that arguably, well, basically it arguably pushed the series off a cliff, for better or for worse. Next time, we talk Final Fantasy Online, Final Fantasy the MMO, Final Fantasy XI. See you then.